shadow. What is the shadow? The shadow is a deeply repressed part of us. Shadow aspects are created through conditioning, false programming, cultural beliefs, religious beliefs. This programming, indoctrination, this repression of the self, of the innate nature, this continuous suppression creates this shadow aspect that is submerged beneath the surface, and without it being integrated can just blow up a whole load of darkness. And so I'll use an example of the sexual shadow. It's this part of us that has been so repressed, so shut down, so shamed. It's like within, okay? And the dangers of not integrating our shadows will be the very end to this planet, because the shadow, when it is not integrated, is a tunnel of darkness. It is destruction. Like, shadow will destruct. If it doesn't have a root, anything that is rooted in love cannot lose its way. Like, it cannot lose its direction, because its root is planted, it's seeded with love, so that it can't take on like a dark form. It can't take on this crazy, out of control form, because its roots are in love. With the shadow, we want to bring awareness to the shadow. We need to become aware of what this shadow even is. Okay, so let's use an example, the sexual shadow. So we bring awareness to this part of us. We then come with compassion to this shadow aspect of us. And how we are compassionate with it is learning and understanding where it comes from. Where does this shadow part of me come from? What is this sexual shadow about? And I can say the sexual shadow is through centuries and lifetimes of shutdown of women and their sensuality and their sexuality, and how this distortion has been created throughout time. It goes so deep, right? We first have to bring awareness to what this is. We then need to understand why it's there. So we need to understand why the shadow is here. Once we understand why it's here, we can then have compassion. We can bring compassion to this shadow part of us. And from compassion, we can then begin to integrate this shadow. We can begin to love upon the shadow part. We need to love this shadow part of us, compassion and love. Bring compassion and love to the shadow part of us. Once we are loving, we can begin to integrate this shadow. We can begin to integrate it back into the self. If we don't integrate our shadows and we don't become aware, if we don't become aware of the shadows, if we don't have compassion for the shadows, if we don't love upon the shadows, and if we don't integrate the shadows will take over. The shadow will be a dark tunnel of destruction. It's almost like a autopilot where you will just bypass the heart and go straight to this like desire that you have, right? This desire that's like, it's a little bit dark, it's a little bit, in fact it can be very dark, right? This desire, like you go and reach for that desire before you've actually rooted back to the heart, into God's love. You just go and reach for that desire without, plugging into the heart first. And that's where things can get dark and ugly, because you haven't rooted it in love. It's like the projection, it's the not in integrity, it's the out of control. Like there's not a truth in it. It's mind of its own energy. And so when we try to bypass the heart and go straight for the desire, we will see how a shadow can play out. Two shadows from two different people that meet, that can get dark real quick. Two unintegrated shadows that meet can be very dangerous. And I feel like it's really important for me to talk about this and say this. I'm just so grateful that, wow, I can build upon this awareness, and I can I have returned to trust in God, and coming back to God is everything. Coming back to God will save this planet. If there was anything in my whole entire life that I truly, truly believe, is that coming back to God will save this planet. Because without God, there is no truth. Without God, there is no love. Without God, there is no roots. Everything needs to be rooted in God for it to be true, for it to be safe, for it to be in integrity. And the reason I speak about this is because we are witnessing the collective shadow playing out. The collective shadow that has a mind of its own. The collective shadow that is dark and destructive and dangerous and murderous. There are killings, wars happening worldwide, coming closer to home. Consistently, we are being shown what unintegrated shadow looks like. And when each and every one of us begins to understand the power of integrating our own shadows and what that does for the collective, what that does for the planet, we will begin to see monumental shifts on this planet. Please do not disregard or disempower your power on this planet. There are so many times of recent where I'm like, myself, my adapted self, because of course there are still parts, this is a never-ending journey, no one is ever fully healed, whenever those parts try to filtrate the truth of God's word, I just have to keep saying to myself, return to God, return to God, return to God. Because that is the truth. The Creator has to be at the root of everything.